Welcome to the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm your hostess, Melanie Joy Pensak, here to share heartfelt conversations with folks recovering from CIRS and with those special people serving the CIRS community. The podcast was created to help bring awareness to the physical, emotional, and mental experiences of folks navigating CIRS day to day. The world needs to know what CIRS folks go through for deeper empathy and understanding. Through stories and vulnerability, we can help the world understand the winding journey of CIRS recovery. Thank you for being here to open your mind and to open your heart. Wow, welcome everybody to season 3 of the Heart of CIRS podcast. It was in September of 2023 that I was trying out a little experiment to see if people would be interested in listening to these heartfelt conversations to the topics about CIRS recovery that don't always get a lot of airtime. And here we are, a year later at season 3 with lots of episodes under the Heart of CIRS podcast belt. And I'm really looking forward to sharing these conversations with you from this upcoming season. In this episode today, I'm going to share more about a health update on what's going on with me with CIRS and share a little bit about grief in CIRS recovery. And then there are many great episodes following this episode. Nick Sisti shares a really incredible story about overcoming CIRS and Lyme that began as a very young child. He was seriously ill as a kiddo and has come such a long way, is now recovered from CIRS and is living a very full life. We've got Louise Carter, who is doing amazing work in Europe and the UK for CIRS, and she's going to teach you how to read your Genie report. Oftentimes, we don't get a lot of time to go over into our Genie in depth with the doctor, or we forget after we leave that appointment. And so if you've had a Genie test, get out that sheet with all the bubbles, and Louise is going to teach you how to read it. Mike Schrantz, indoor environmental professional, is going to take us on a deep dive into all things HVAC. That's a topic that people often don't want to have to deal with, but it's very important. Then there is Morgan Gladowski, who is a CIRS overcomer, health coach, breath worker, and she and I are going to talk about some interesting perspectives and do a public service announcement for all those in the spiritual world. You are probably working with clients if you're a Reiki practitioner, if you're an energy worker, if you are a shaman, if you are a yoga teacher. These people are coming to you and seeking relief. And it would be amazing if you knew a little bit about CIRS, so you could encourage them to think about environmental exposures as part of their profile. I have a great conversation with patient Camry Mosman, and we discuss the importance of mental health awareness and getting to the root cause of many mental health concerns, with that being tick-borne illnesses and co-infections. So we both now have that as a part of our profiles, which I'll get into in a little bit. And it's really an important topic that I'm seeing come up with many people that I'm talking to with CIRS as they go through the Shoemaker protocol. If they get stuck, tick-borne illnesses are often there and waiting to be discovered. And we have Dr. Laura Varga, who shares some really great info on how CIRS is actually GU syndrome in Eastern medicine. So spoiler alert, this has been around for thousands of years, folks. Dr. Varga is putting together this personalized plan that comes from Eastern medicine with the Shoemaker protocol binders to help people holistically heal from CIRS or GU. And then we have Dr. Christian Navarro-Torres back, second time on the Heart of CIRS podcast. His first episode is all about his experiences early on with CIRS and how he got to where he was in the CIRS community. And in this episode, we talk a lot more on his research background, and we actually go through a research paper. So you'll have a link to the paper so you can learn how to read the research, pay attention to what you're seeing, so you can share and teach your other doctors or people in your life what is up we shouldn't have to do this, but we know as SIRS, we often have to take on that burden to be the educator. It's really been an empowering, eye-opening season, and I can't wait for you to hear all of those episodes. It's meant so much to me. Those who have reached out and said that the podcast has been meaningful to them, it's really great. It helps to keep me going, making episodes and talking to people from this lens and framework. So thank you. If the podcast has touched your heart, please share it with other people who may be interested, and giving ratings on iTunes and Spotify is super helpful. Donating to keep the podcast growing is also really helpful through Ko-Fi, and sharing on social media the episodes that are meaningful to you also really help to bring awareness to SIRS. We are making a difference one person at a time. I do believe that. Let's start with a little health update. There is an episode, season 1, episode 1, where I go deep into my early experiences pre-SIRS that sort of set me up for SIRS. I've been very public with my medical journey because I do believe that I represent a group of people that are even unique within the SIRS community. And I really want people to start to notice things about their own experience going through SIRS, and speaking up to their doctors and talking to others about hidden tick-borne co-infections, because that really has become a part of my SIRS journey. At the end of 2023, I was still having cyclical neurological symptoms, even though I was in clean housing and I was on full dose VIP for many months. And the expectation is when you reach the top of the Shoemaker protocol with VIP is that you're going to have a lot of symptoms disappear. And while certain things did shift and change, like my cognitive endurance, especially for working and communication, really increased. My word finding and word flow really improved, which was great to see as a speech and language pathologist. I was able to problem solve better emotional regulation. There were definite changes that I was seeing, but I was still having tremendous difficulties with digestion, limited food options, not really able to bring foods back into my diet, not having a mast cell reaction to them, but having a situation that would arise where I would feel very sick and unwell after I would eat or try to eat a different variety of foods. These are healthy things: fruits, meats, grains, all of the organic, high quality stuff. That was very confusing to me. And I would have these, I started to track it. It was like every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks. I would put a little note on my calendar where I would have these symptoms pop up where I would literally not be able to walk. I would be in bed for a couple days. My ankles and feet would turn in. I could barely bear weight. The left side of my body felt very weak and like it was hanging off of my body. And it just didn't make sense that I would be continuing to have these neurological symptoms, because most classic mold SIRS folks that go through the Shoemaker protocol, they are on VIP and these things start to really disappear. And I was doing everything right. So it was perplexing. I really was feeling like I had underlying tick-borne co-infections. The more I started to learn about Lyme and then other co-infections like Bartonella and tick-borne relapsing fever, there are multiple co-infections that you can have from ticks or fleas or cat scratches or anything over the years that can be hidden and dormant in your nervous system or in your body. And SIRS is the perfect grounds for these to show back up. But what's interesting is when you have SIRS, these co-infections don't seem to show up until you start to get to the point where the SIRS is starting to heal more, the immune system's starting to heal. And then the body's able to better identify these infections in your body and then start to tag them with antibodies. And then they start to show up on testing. So basically, at the end of 2023, I was determined to get my physical abilities and the rest of my health back. I decided that I wanted to do hyperbaric oxygen therapy because it's very regenerative, lots of positive reviews, and results for different types of conditions. I was concerned about my nerves and my tissues, and I felt like I really lost a lot of physical ability and strength. I felt like hyperbaric oxygen therapy would be incredibly regenerative for me. But it became clear as I started to do that, that there were infections going on. Within the first several sessions, I would feel incredibly sick after the hyperbaric chamber. 2 to 3 hours after, I would have what you would call a Herxheimer reaction, flu-like symptoms in bed. And it actually started to build up and get worse and worse as I tried to do about 8 hyperbaric dives. The people at the center were saying, if you don't start to feel better after 3 or 4 sessions, because usually the first 3 or 4 sessions, you're killing off infections and things that can't survive in a high oxygen environment, they die off in the body. There's a backlog of endotoxin and different bacterias and things that your body has to remove. And if you're not starting to feel better, that it could be highly indicative of tick-borne co-infections and Lyme. I did testing and I did a full 11 panel from Hygienics because my insurance covered that panel, and it showed multiple issues. Some of the Lyme bands were positive, some were indiscriminate. It showed possible Bartonella, as some of them were indiscriminate. It showed active anaplasmosis. It showed history of tick-borne relapsing fever and rickettsiosis. There were 5 infections going on there, and it felt like it really validated what I was seeing. I decided to go on antibiotics for 3 months and definitely had die-off symptoms all throughout that period of time, and then switched to herbal medications because I didn't want to continue to be on antibiotics, and they actually caused some thyroid issues for me. So it was an incredibly interesting February of 2024 until present, which is September. I've been actively treating these infections, and the cyclical symptoms still come. They're not as intense, but they are present. Sometimes 2 or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, I get a period of time where I feel very unwell. It was interesting. I retested my co-infections and did the same exact test, and it looks like maybe the anaplasmosis has improved or it's not showing up on testing anymore. Same with the rickettsiosis, tick-borne relapsing fever, much less, and a different Lyme band showing up, as well as the fish Bartonella test showing positive this round. And the more I listen to different physicians that are working with Bartonella specifically, they are discussing how it can show up later and later as you go through treatment. And particularly with a CIRS patient, that's not surprising. It has been a journey. So my recovery is taking longer than expected because of this, but I do see small, slow, steady progress going this route. I'm a very sensitive patient, and so I have to take a lot of the herbals as teas. I do a variety of herbals as foot baths to absorb them that way, sometimes by mouth, but not too frequently that way. I'm exploring different methods to try to reduce the load of all of these different co-infections in my body. You know, it's interesting. Nobody wants to be that CIRS patient that doesn't fit the typical triangle model. Everybody wants to be the CIRS patient that can go from the base all the way to the top, and doctors know what to do with you. But even within the CIRS community, I was presenting as somebody that the doctors were not 100% sure what else was going on. I really had to step into my own empowerment to explore it and take the reins to figure out what was going on. I feel like I know at this point. I feel like I'm on the right track given the response to the therapy and the response to my abilities. I'm now able to walk down 3 flights of stairs. I'm able to walk to my mailbox in my apartment community and back several times a week. I have a little more physical endurance to actually do some exercises to develop some strength and muscle tone. And I'm starting to be able to eat a few more foods that are really helpful for the body to recover. These are all really positive signs. And, you know, if you are somebody that is stuck on the protocol and you are in clean housing and you don't have Marcons and you're on your VIP, but some of the symptoms aren't completely going away, especially after 6 months. And there's anything cyclical, neurological, or digestion related that's not resolving, I highly encourage you to look into this. Some of the red flags that I was seeing were my MMP9 would not go down, my TGF beta 1 would not go down, my ADH osmolality and VEGF got really bad again after the hyperbaric. It had been okay and it went down again. And since then, my MMP9 is normalized, as well as my ADH osmolality and my VEGF. Those markers have changed, and my TGF beta 1 is coming down. That's really important to note that my MMP9 did not normalize until I started tick-borne co-infection treatment for 5 months. It took that long. People who are really having mast cell symptoms, high sensitivity while they're still on VIP for 6 months, I think that that's a red flag for things like babesia. I also think that persistent digestive symptoms, SIBO, sensitivities. I'm hearing a lot of people that end up getting diagnosed with Bartonella have food issues and the gut issues. I would actually have periods of time where I would feel nauseous and not want to eat for several days. Bartonella can cause anorexia-like symptoms, and this is something that came up for me. I would just have periods of time where unexpectedly, out of the blue, I didn't have an exposure. I would feel very weak. I would feel like I couldn't walk, or one side of my body was hanging off of my body. There would also be times where like my ears would just ring out of the blue. So some of these symptoms overlap with typical SIRS symptoms, but it's strange that they would just disappear and come back and disappear and come back when there's no other environmental exposure. I hope that that all perks your interest and is hopeful, because I know that it is something that is not always accepted and recognized even within the SIRS community. So it's really important you can talk to some people who are going to hear you. And I'm happy to help you build a case to take to a SIRS provider to get some testing done to look into this if you feel like that's your profile. But overall, I'm really hopeful. I feel like I've still got some work to do in terms of treating these infections, especially with so many, but we are on the right track, and I see it and I feel it, and that's what's the most important to me. One thing I really want to talk about today is the grief that shows up in different ways during SIRS recovery. This is a topic that I've recently become more committed to in working with SIRS folks. I completed coursework with David Kessler, who is a well-recognized grief educator. It's something that I want to be able to offer SIRS folks, because we really need spaces where people can share the grief that's really unique to going through a SIRS experience. Grief is really our natural human response to losing what we love, and it's very real during SIRS recovery. Grief can show up in different ways. Sometimes it just appears disguised as anger and frustration, erupting towards little things that come up. Sometimes it shows up as deep longing, talking about the way things used to be. Sometimes grief shows up in SIRS recovery as a sensation of numbness or feeling detached from life and pleasant emotions. And sometimes it shows up as sadness, with or without tears. You'll hear me say this multiple times, that it is normal to have grief during SIRS recovery. And I want you to really hear that you don't fix it. There's nothing bad or wrong about grief. Grief is a natural human experience. I actually feel like it's a very sacred experience, and you live through it. You feel it, you experience it, and you survive it. So if you're grieving, it's really important to have people that can listen to you, that aren't going to try to fix you, that aren't going to judge you for grieving. You need to find folks that really understand and give yourself some love. I'm seeing with myself and with other people as you start to heal and recover, because in the initial parts of SIRS recovery, you're very much trying to survive and get through the steps and get to a place of semi-functioning again. And then you forget what you're missing sometimes when you're in that survival mode. But when you get out of the survival mode and you start to see that the same people aren't around, that friends have drifted away, that family members might be judging your experience, that you can't work, that you can't do your hobbies, that you can't travel, all of this brings up grief, especially when you see your friends and family members and other people living their lives in different ways. It's interesting. I think one of the ways and reasons I have gotten through grief is because I've been through periods of serious grief before. When I was a teenager, my mom died right when I got into university, my freshman year in college. And then several other family members died. And it was this year of death and grief. And it was very difficult at that age to experience, especially a sudden loss of somebody so significant in my life. Nobody at that time really could hear me or understand my experience. I was in college, so a lot of friends really wanted to just go out and be social. And so that's what I did, enjoyed that. I really liked it. But I also really needed a place that I could be a daughter that was grieving their mother. So my interest in grief shows up as understanding that there needs to be a place that people can go because I didn't have that. And I found my own ways to survive and get through and to remember and honor my mother. And it was interesting over time. I had other friends who lost parents, and I became that person that people felt like they could come to with their grief. And they would talk to me and share their stories. And I really made a point not to judge them and just to hear them and listen. And it's super common for people to talk to me and just cry, cry, cry because they know that I'm not going to try to stop them. I'm going to let them cry. I'm going to let them have their feelings and experience. It's a very special gift to be able to hold space for someone just to live the rawness of their human experience. When I went through that period of grief with my mother, I also came out of the grief. I experientially realized that it was going to shift and change. And so now that I'm going through the grief with CIRS, underneath all of that, there's a deep knowing that even though I feel very deeply that I'm sad or miss certain parts of my life pre-CIRS, I also know that it's going to regenerate and life will change and things will happen that are positive again. Challenges are really the grounds for deep growth, personal development, and appreciation for life. You know, we really see when we lose something or somebody dies or we lose a part of ourselves, the importance of being present in life and the importance of paying attention to the small things and how some of the things we thought were important really aren't that important. It's interesting. A lot of people don't realize that they're grieving, and there's sometimes taboo about even saying the word grief. Like if I say to somebody, you're grieving, sometimes they don't want to hear it or believe it. There's some sort of rejection of that word. But I really think we need to speak to that word so that people feel they can express it and that it's normalized. It can show up, as I mentioned earlier, as sadness, anger, and frustration, and all these other things. Grief is really a sacred place to be. It's something that gives us the opportunity to really honor what we love. We don't do this in everyday life because we're busy and we're focused on other things. And it's a process of the heart. The heart breaks and then it opens again deeper, and it opens the possibility to loving in a really profound way. For me, grief is something that I process through creativity and art and ritual. It's something that I don't always have to talk about. It's something sometimes I write about, but sometimes just engaging in art and painting and nature mandalas act of actually creating something transforms the grief because we remember that new life, new experience can be created, and that with death comes life. There is a cycle. We can transform that sadness into something really profound and beautiful. So I work a lot with art and the people that I talk with, I encourage them to do art therapy or find a modality of creativity to express their grief in some way. Ritual is the other piece that I think is really important. I run grief healing circles that are a sacred place where people can come and speak to the emotional experience they're having around grief. And when you're in the presence of others who are sharing their grief and you are grieving, it helps you remember you're not alone, that it is a common human experience. When you see others being kind and compassionate to you in your grief and honoring their grief, it gives you the permission to be kind and compassionate to yourself. When you feel that natural movement of the heart to be present for somebody else who's grieving and to care for them or to feel kindness towards them, it reminds you that you can also do that for yourself. Because our society really reflects that grief is not okay, that grief is something that should be hidden or has a time limit. And I'm here to tell you that grief does not have a time limit and it doesn't have to be hidden. And we can make it acceptable and we can tell people we're grieving and tell them what we need while we're grieving. For many people, it's treating themselves like they would treat a little child who's maybe lost a pet. If there was a child in your life that their favorite dog died, what would you do to make them feel better? You would treat them really well. You'd give extra hugs. You'd make them feel cozy. You'd prepare good foods and listen to music and watch TV shows you like. And grief is really about holding your heart compassionately, being present to yourself in the sadness and suffering of the losses of life. You hold it gently, just like you would hold a very fragile baby or like you would hold an egg that you don't want to break. You can hold your own heart and your grief experience in that way. I want to share with you an article I recently was asked to write for Open to Hope Foundation around grief with chronic illness, to share a little bit more about how I've turned my grief into creativity and writing. Maybe you will align with some of the things that I'm saying. Grief during chronic illness. I remember when I started to hear the word chronic from the mouths of people that were involved in my health. I recall the acupuncturist who asked how long my symptoms had been happening. She nodded knowingly at my answer. Oh, so this is chronic. I hear the doctor who seemed pleased with himself when diagnosing me with something that was simply repeating what I said I was experiencing. Aha, sounds like chronic fatigue. I was surprised to hear this word reflected back to me. When I looked at my health deductions and expenses for the year, the proof was staring me in the face through high numbers. Thousands of dollars were spent hopping from doctor to doctor, trying supplement program after program, acupuncture, herbs, mind-body practices, counseling, and meditation retreats. The list of efforts to prevent my declining health was shocking. It was indeed chronic. Eventually, the management of the symptoms I experienced became too much for the body to handle. After unknowingly living in water-damaged buildings, finding mold, dodging wildfire, a pandemic, 2 COVID vaccines, and more water-damaged buildings, I ended up in a severely depleted inflammatory state with an illness called CIRS. Some in the world may recognize this as, quote, mold illness, but the reality is CIRS is caused by much more than just mold. Folks with a genetic predisposition who then have biotoxin exposures to molds, fungi, bacteria, seafood, spiders, tick bites, or viruses can become stuck in their innate immune system. The body doesn't identify and get rid of the toxins adequately. Over time, the inflammation that's generated from the innate immune system causes damage to the body's precious energy source, the mitochondria, as well as to the brain and multiple organ systems in the body. Sadly, many folks with CIRS don't get to the root cause and suffer for years. Lucky in my case, I found a diagnosis and a research-based protocol proven to reverse CIRS. However, getting to the point of diagnosis and through the Shoemaker protocol brought me close to an old friend I once knew called grief. Here are the flavors of grief during chronic illness. The experience of chronic illness is one not many understand until they or their loved ones go through it. Here are some of the flavors of grief one might experience. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve the time they wish they could be with friends and family instead of in bed, cleaning, or seeking appropriate health treatments. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve the employment they used to be able to hold as they may be forced to go on disability or go online to work as they heal. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve the dreams they had to start a business, buy a home, or start a family. So much money is spent and lost healing from this illness. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve their ability to be active, go outdoors, and travel. Fatigue, nervous system changes, and environmental toxins can impact the pleasure of moving the body, being in nature, and on vacations. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve their identities, their moods, and their minds. They're not able to show up in the way they used to in community. Agitation is common, and the mind may be foggy or critical. Folks with chronic illness and CIRS grieve their creative expression. Energy often does not support creativity and hobbies and self-expression through clothes and makeup for a long time in the illness. It took me time to realize I was grieving, and then the loss of interest in life made sense. While we usually relate grief to the death of a loved one and animals, we can miss how the numbness, sadness, and collapsed body are being held in a state of grief during chronic illness. Noticing grief, naming it, and beginning to feel it is the start of healing through the experience. Acknowledging the grief comes from a deep love for life, as we know it helps those with chronic illness to honor the changing ways of the body, mind, and life experience. Dear grief, thank you for reminding me how much I love my ability to move, to participate, to engage, to create, and to contribute. May this experience of chronic illness deepen my ability to be compassionate to myself and others in pain. May my experience wake people up to the awareness of this issue in the world and create more understanding for folks navigating CIRS and chronic illness. Thank you. I choose to bow to my grief. I choose to honor the grief. I choose to see it. And I choose to allow the grief to open my heart, to remind me of the life that I want to live now. Because the reality is I am still alive, I'm healing, and I am grateful for that. If you are grieving, if you need somebody to hear you, I warmly invite you to book a session with me, a one-on-one emotional support session. I do peer-to-peer grief support. And I'll also be offering a course for CIRS folks specifically related to grief that will be experiential, where you will have the opportunity to engage in a variety of activities that are to help you process and make sense of the grief and to be able to turn your grief into maybe hope. Some people decide to turn their traumatic and sad experiences into something called post-traumatic growth, to use their experiences to help and support others. I find that generosity is something that also helps me to get through grief. Being able to support others, being able to know that I have something to offer and that the experience is not in vain is so helpful to work through the emotions. Michelle Obama has a quote. People were asking her what she was going to do after she left the White House and if she was going to go back to the way things were before. And she said, there's no getting back on track. What track? What's the new track? What do I want to do? And what do I love? I love that. That really touches me when it comes to CIRS. There's no going back, but there can be a new track. And it can be equally as beautiful if you work for it. What you do and what you love may shift and change, or it may become much clearer as you go through CIRS recovery and through the process of grief. I know grief is hard to bear and that most folks want an answer on how to make the pain go away quickly, but it's through the suffering that we are able to feel and love. No one gets around going through grief in life. It can show up in different ways, and your way is through this illness. It's a natural part of life, and being with others and speaking about it or processing it in the way that works for you is really important. Grief doesn't need to be a secret. It is not a burden, and it's definitely not something that you need to fix. You are lovable and important, even in your grieving state. I invite you to come along to a quarterly CIRS Healing Grief Circle. If that's something that resonates with you, you can find and contact me through my website, which is www.melaniepensak.com. I run them every change of the season. It's a reminder to be able to let go of what is no longer serving us, to move forward in our lives, and to be seen by others in similar CIRS circumstances. Everyone shows up, is present for one another. There's no expectation to have to say the right thing after they talk. You're just holding space, carrying people through the rough waters, and being seen when you need to be seen. Thank you for your kind attention and wishing you a lot of love. I hope you enjoy season 3. I love hearing from people who are listening to the Heart of CIRS podcast. If you would like to send me a message, please contact me through my website, melaniepensak.com, because I cannot respond to fan mail sent through Buzzsprout or through the podcast website. There was somebody that did reach out with a wonderful message, and unfortunately, I have no way of contacting you through fan mail. If that person just happens to be listening, please reach out through my website. And anybody else, my website or the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram would be a great way to reach me directly. Thank you for listening and for your kind attention. To keep in touch, follow the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram. You can visit melaniepensak.com/the Heart of CIRS to donate. Your generosity helps to keep this podcast growing. May the awareness of CIRS spread far and wide, helping to change millions of lives for the better.